The International Association for Near-Death Studies presents NDE Radio, a weekly exploration of near-death experiences and similar encounters with the other side. Now, here's your host, Lee Witting.
Welcome to another edition of NDE Radio, brought to you by IANDS, the International Association for Near-Death Studies. I'm your host, Lee Witting. Our guest today, Kim Peralta, grew up in a non-religious family in New York City and describes herself as being agnostic when she began her decades-long study of yoga. Given that fact, she was startled one day to feel the guiding hand of a spirit being correcting her posture. Since that awakening experience, she has been sensitive to other personal mystical experiences in her life, including psychic communications with her son. Kim began practicing Iyengar yoga in 1987 under the late senior Iyengar teacher Mary Dunn. She began training in India at the Iyengar Institute in 1989 and was certified in 1991. In 1992, she and a handful of teachers co-founded the Iyengar Yoga Institute of New York, and in 96 was granted permission by BKS Iyengar to open the Iyengar Yoga School of Northern New Jersey, where she was director for 12 years. Her teaching certificate was upgraded to Intermediate 3 in 1997, and she eventually moved to Maine in 2013 and opened the Iyengar Yoga Center in Brooksville, Maine, about 20 minutes from where I live, as a matter of fact. Kim, welcome to NDE Radio.
Hi.
Hi. Kim, I've often said that we're all entitled to at least one personal mystical encounter with the other side in our lives. And if we're open to it, it can alter the future direction of our lives. And I want to talk to you today about the mystical aspects of yoga, but let's begin with that spirit being that corrected your alignment and began your curiosity about the spiritual.
Okay, well, this was, over 30 years ago now. I wasn't a yoga teacher at that time, but I was interested in yoga mostly for the physical benefits. And I was taking part in a yoga retreat, and there was the retreat was in a renovated monastery. Which had been turned into an ashram in Pennsylvania. And in the ashram, there was a little room where you could go in any time. It was always open. And it was like a little meditation room where anybody who wanted to, who felt like it could go in and sit and meditate. And it was about the size of the average bathroom, very small. There was a little shrine and a little seat where you could sit down on the floor in front of it, and a clock on the shelf, and a nice carpet on the floor, and all peaceful. So one day I was in there meditating, and I just felt a hand gently but very deliberately realign my sacrum, which is the base, the triangular bone at the base of the spine. When that bone is misaligned, your posture suffers, and when you're meditating, that you have to have your spine has to be erect. So I just felt this. It was like it was giving me a correction, and realigning my spine. It was very gentle, very deliberate. I felt it was warm, it was penetrating. I felt I could almost see the waves. It kind of came in waves through my body. And I felt very surely that it was female. I just had this feeling that it was female. It also felt like she was crouching down by me on my right side, and as she was adjusting me. And it only lasted a few seconds. I turned around. I knew I was alone in the room, but I turned around anyway, and of course I was alone in the room. There was only one door into the room, and that door was 3 feet behind me. It was such a tiny room. And I just absolutely know that it was real. It was not my imagination. Of course, most people would say, oh, that's just your imagination, and I can't prove it to them that it wasn't, but I know. I just know that it wasn't. I went back to my dormitory. I was sharing a room with colleague who was also on the retreat, and she was not an agnostic at all. She was very much into other worldly experiences and everything, and she immediately said, "Oh, that's your spirit guide." She said, "That must be your spirit guide." She said, "Everybody has one." And after that, I just started softening up a little bit on my sort of agnostic / atheistic stance, and began to, just kind of open my mind up to the idea. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of people, I guess, decide to practice yoga for their physical fitness.
Right.
As you did back then. And probably not too many, I don't know if this is true of your students, but not too many see it as a spiritual practice as well.
There are wonderful, wonderful physical benefits. And it's perfectly normal and natural and right that people should come to take yoga for the physical benefits. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But there is a whole philosophical side to it, which most teachers are not teaching. It depends on where you study. There are styles of yoga here in the West who emphasize more the philosophy than the actual physical part of it. It just depends on what style you end up with.
Well, since you know the nature of this show,
right.
My direction would be to talk about the spiritual aspects
yes,
of Iyengar.
Absolutely.
And so tell us a little about that. You told me that this comes back. Today's tradition of yoga comes out of the deep historic roots of Hindu mysticism.
In Indian philosophy, there are 6 branches of the Hindu religion, and now we're talking like a long time ago. It was all sort of formalized. Think 1000 BCE. And yoga is one of those branches. Okay, I'm not an expert on any of those other branches of yoga, of Indian philosophy, rather. I know what I know about yoga from my own practice and, the style that I've studied, the teachers that I've had. So yoga goes back in the mists of time. It was never written down until about 2,000 years ago, and that is accredited to Patanjali. And there may be more than one author, but today, and a lot of people are trying to find out, doing historical. I don't know if we'll ever know if if it was just one person or more than one, but he was the first person to write down the teachings of yoga. Up until that point, it had just been transmitted orally from teacher to student, and mainly to very upper-class, wealthy royalty, and it certainly wasn't taught to women. That was there have been some famous, there are some yoginis that go back in history, but they're very few and far between.
Yes.
It's mostly a male thing. Yeah. So when he wrote it down, that potentially made it accessible to all of us. Yeah.
As long as women were allowed to read.
Right.
In some societies.
What he did was he organized it into 8 steps, Ashtanga. Asht means 8, Anga means a step or a ladder or a rung of a ladder. And he, so that people like the average person like you and me could, understand and reap the benefits of the practice in a practical step-by-step way.
Okay.
Okay. And so the type of yoga that I practice and teach is based on the work of Patanjali. I'm an Iyengar teacher, and my teacher, B.K.S. Iyengar, bases his work on Patanjali, on the writings of Patanjali, and specifically the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, which are a series of terse aphorisms each sentence containing a world of wisdom and a world of interpretation as well, actually.
Well, here's a question that will show my ignorance of yoga. I studied Qigong for a while, and what is the nature of Qi as yoga understands it, and how is that?
That's prana. In yoga language, that the Sanskrit word for that is prana, which means energy. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
It also means breath. See, Sanskrit words have multiple meanings, so you have to be very careful when you want to use a Sanskrit word to check out all the different meanings, make sure that you're getting it right. And so, but in any case, Qi is the same. You can interpret that as prana.
Okay.
Yeah.
And breath, of course, in the Judeo-Christian tradition is what God breathed into us.
Yeah.
That's the energy of existence.
Mm-hmm.
Is that, does yoga consider that aspect of it as well?
Well, with yoga, you're moving through the layers of the body of the human being, and the body is the grossest, and the breath is more subtle. You follow? So you go from the outer layers to the inner layers. There's the body, there's the emotions, there's the intellect. You follow? These are all layers of our human embodiment, and the breath is, in terms of the physical practice of yoga, that's another. Further, the purpose of yoga is to penetrate the mind, is to go deeper into the mind. And the premise is that the mind is not the brain. It exists eternally outside of the brain. Okay.
Right.
The brain is just something that filters the mind. And so the breath, when you do breath work, when you do pranayama, which means control of the breath, you are going more deeply into the mind than asana, which is the postures, the physical part. But you begin with asana, because if you don't begin with asana, you don't have a good handle on how to do the pranayama, because it's still physical. So, seated meditation, asana practice, and pranayama, these are all physical pursuits.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And
are they intended to quiet the brain so that
yes,
you can?
They're intended to create. So all day long, the body is an object, and the brain is kind of our senses are what's coming into us. We're like the subject. The experiencer is the subject. The body, when you do yoga, becomes the subject, and it's hard to explain. If you cannot really, you can't really differentiate between the two. There's no real split between the mind and the body. You can get there through the body. Okay, that's the premise of Iyengar yoga anyway, that it's the penetration has to begin at the skin. It goes to the muscle, that goes to the bone, it goes to the nerves, it goes to the breath. And ultimately, you shed your awareness of those layers, and you commune with the larger self, the self with a capital S, the cosmic self, of which we are all a part. So, the idea that the individual self, you, me, and every other human being, is a manifestation, a temporary physical manifestation of the larger self. That's how it ties into your radio show.
and when you talk about a capital S, could you attach the word soul to that?
Yes, absolutely. Well, then you get into, but the soul is still individual, is it not?
Yes. So
we're not talking about the soul, really. We're talking about the great consciousness of the big soup that we're all in,
So then let me ask you, how could someone be practicing yoga with that information and that knowledge and that pursuit and still be either agnostic or atheist?
Well, because I have no idea about anybody else, but in terms of myself, I would say that it's not so much denial, but I was in ignorance of because I also practiced yoga for I've been practicing since, I've actually been practicing longer than I've been teaching, so I've been practicing this method of yoga anyway since 1986, and I was actually even practicing before that since I was a kid, so without having a teacher. But with, I never connected to the two because I just did it as a physical practice. It fascinated me physically. I loved the way that it made me feel after a practice, but I never equated it with any kind of, afterlife or anything like that. I never bothered to connect the dots,
Mm-hmm.
And as I was telling you the other day, Lee, I actually came around from a different place to this realization. It didn't really, I connected it to yoga later on. I was actually reading a lot of quantum mechanics and quantum physics books, and that's where I started thinking that there was an afterlife, that we don't that we go on, that we don't just die. And it was through reading the science that I guess I was such a practical person that it took the science to get me to become interested, even,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, science and enlightened religion seem to be going in the same direction. I mean, they're both in the pursuit of truth, and if truth is truth, then they will come to the same point.
Exactly. That's correct. And as we know, these truths have been set down for thousands of years, that the quantum physicists are now, confirming.
Right. And the interest now that science has in the nature of consciousness is also probably what somebody who's deeply into yoga or qigong, for that matter, can identify with.
Yes. I mean, you see, I'm not one to take things. I'm not so gullible. When I was always exposed ever since I started. I mean, I've been exposed to the philosophical part of yoga, but I would stop short at believing in a God. I would just stop short at that. And I still don't like the word because it's just too loaded. There's so much hysteria around the word, whether you're an atheist or whether you're religious. I mean, it's all. I don't think organized religion has it right, and I don't think the atheists have it right either.
Right. Or organized religion has tended to contaminate it by putting limitations and definitions and rules and regulations, attaching that to their understanding of God.
Yeah. I mean, we do have our own guidelines in yoga, and you could call them rules. They're very similar to the Ten Commandments. The premise, the foundation, the bedrock of yoga is ahimsa, nonviolence, do no harm. You cannot proceed on the path of yoga unless you become nonviolent, and that has a lot to do with the violence that we do on ourselves. And then when we have bad posture, we're being violent to our spinal column. We're being violent to the body. You could look at it that way, and in that way, the philosophy, the spiritual aspect connects directly to the physical. And that's what we teach in the Iyengar system. You don't put your foot in one direction and not turn your knee the same way, because if you do, you're going to hurt your knee. You're going to get knee damage. So, the alignment, the precise alignment that we teach has to do with ahimsa. It is do no harm. It's the first rule of teaching.
Right.
That's what's as a teacher, that's what is uppermost on our minds always.
When you look at Hindu society, though, there's just in the class system alone, there's a lot of violence.
Oh my goodness! The Bhagavad Gita is the foundation for the caste system. I mean, come on. Yes, that's what all organized religions. I've never met one that didn't have a lot of violence and, I mean, even if it is meant to be allegorical, even so. There are people who take that stuff literally.
Oh, yes.
And that's
the entire Old Testament is, full of violence and describes a violent God, for that matter.
I mean, it's okay to for the rest of us to look at it and say, oh, well, esoterically it doesn't mean that. We can interpret it. But what I'd like to say is, I've always wondered, if someone wanted to write down to give us help in our human existence, and they wanted to give us some guidelines, why would they disguise it? Why would they put it in terms of, a picture of, a war or violence of any kind? Why don't they just say what it is? Why don't they, I've always wondered, and I've come to the conclusion that it's because human beings always want to control each other, and they use religion to do that.
The structure of the material world seems to be duality, and that gets redefined into good and evil, and therefore you've got a built-in struggle psychologically without even trying.
But to put it in terms of stories, knowing full well that people are going to believe it literally, I mean, that to me is that's not that great. I've always had a problem with that.
Well, fundamental religion doesn't take it as an allegory. They take it as literal.
Literal. That's what I'm saying. There's always a danger. It's dangerous.
And then it becomes a political tool, and that's really what's destroying. I think destroying Christianity today, in a lot of ways.
I mean, it's a big church. There are a lot of different. It's a huge church. It has very right wing and very left wing, on the ends of it, and then everything in between. The Catholic Church and the Christian Church, if you want to say Christianity, and I'm sure that's true in Islam and in Judaism and every Hinduism. You have the liberal end of it and you have the conservative end of it. But I just feel that as soon as you try to organize that, as soon as you tell people to follow rules rather than set guidelines and give them real practical ways of achieving, of bettering themselves and improving ourselves. That's the problem with religion. They don't really give you a practical way of actually doing the things they say you should do. How do you be a better person? How can you be more nonviolent in your thought, in your speech? What are the practical ways of doing that?
Well, the early Christians lived communally, and that is probably what we were intended to do, to look out for one another, which leads me to my next question, which is yoga seems to be very much an individual practice. Does it cut you off? Do you feel separated from the rest of the community by practicing yoga?
Oh, no, because the effects connect me to people more. I mean, I'm a real loner. I live alone. I enjoy it. I defend my alone time, and I like to socialize, but in small amounts. At the same time, I look kindly upon the world. I have I expect people to be kind, and I believe that most people are kind, unless I learn otherwise. But in terms of, for me, the physical and emotional relief that I get from a practice of yoga makes me feel kind toward people and makes me feel connected, to people that I wouldn't ordinarily choose to have as friends or, so for me, no, it's actually been a connecting factor rather than a separating thing, although it is a practice that I do alone.
Where do you suppose BKS Iyengar is now?
Oh, my goodness gracious. Who knows? You're more of an expert on that than I am. See, I'm just a newbie with this NDE stuff. And so you tell me, I mean, what I've gleaned is that, we die. Our consciousness goes back to join the great all, but we retain our individuality and our memory of this life. And at the same time, we either choose to go on to another life at some point, or we blend and go off somewhere else, and that's all very mysterious. So, actually, gosh, but I do feel his presence. I have to say that I invoke his presence when I practice and when I teach, for sure. And I sometimes feel he's in the room, Yeah.
All right. Yeah. I was wondering if that was something, since he was basically equivalent to an enlightened master in his own particular area of expertise, whether he was sticking around with his students and with the world in general. I mean, the notion of mystics who can either merge with the light or come back and wait for the rest of us to mature.
Bodhisattva, yeah.
The bodhisattva notion, exactly.
Right. Well,
Whether
he could be doing that. Who knows? It's just that's something. I don't know if we can know that now. Well, while we're still in this physical world, I don't know if that's something that's kind of beyond human understanding at this point. You know, as long as we're human in the human form, I don't know that we can really get a whole picture of that. You know what?
What was he like as a person?
Well, as a teacher, he was a taskmaster. He was very harsh, demanding, relentlessly demanding. As a person, socially, he was like a sweet old man.
So you saw both sides of his personality then? Right.
Well, mostly I saw him as a student. So he was he just instilled fear into your heart. But he would just basically push you through the work, and you'd think you were going to die, and then at the end of it you'd have nothing but absolute gratitude. He was a great teacher, brilliant. I mean, it's indescribable, the experience of being his student. I was very fortunate to have been taught by him as much as I was. There are teachers senior to me who have had more experience of him. Those are the people I invite to come here and teach the summer workshops. They've had real longevity as students with him. I did go to the Institute frequently from 1989 onwards, once every year, every 2 years, to study there, and I did have a lot of him, but I also was taught by his daughter Gita, who from the early 90s took over teaching most of the classes for the teachers and the longtime practitioners. And
what part
he was
of
always
India?
there, and he taught, but he wasn't officially the teacher. He would just take over the class, and he was always there. Yeah.
What part of India is it located in?
In Pune, which is in Maharashtra state, the western armpit. It's kind of like middle western part of the India.
Mm-hmm. Back in the 60s, I had friends that would go to India trying to gain 2 weeks worth of enlightenment, or even longer. Of course, did you feel that it's a spiritual country, or
no more than
what was
anywhere
your
else?
reaction?
No more than anywhere else. The people, you have to understand that religion is not something that people in India or in many countries in the world, religion is an everyday thing. They live according to the religion. They don't just go to church on Sunday and that's the end of it. They every day, it's like so it's bound up with daily life much more than here in the West. But I would not say that again, there's a difference between spirituality and organized religion. And there's just as much violence in India's history, and they do have a terribly unfair caste system.
Yes.
And as I said, the backbone of that caste system is the Bhagavad Gita, which is the equivalent of our, it's the most widely read Hindu. It's like our Bible. People read it like we read the Bible, or Muslims read the Quran. That's the book, and it supports the caste system.
Kim, we have run out of time, unfortunately. A half hour goes very quickly.
Wow, yeah.
But I want to thank you so much for coming on, and on very short notice. We just contacted each other the other day, and that was because you'd gotten in touch with IANDS.
Right.
So I'm glad
exactly.
I'm glad you're interested in what we're doing, and
I'm so curious about it. Yes, I'm so glad we made that connection. Yeah. It was
terrific.
A miracle that you live just over there, like 25 minutes away from here. Can't believe it.
Well, a guest a couple of weeks ago lives in India, so through the miracle of Skype, we can do all sorts of communication.
Yes, I listened to that on the podcast.
Yes.
That was a good interview. Yeah.
Susan, yeah.
Yeah, she was great. Yeah.
Tell folks your website address so they can.
Oh, yes. Well, it's IANGAR. That's spelled IYEN, N like Nancy, that is, GAR, IANGAR, Yoga, Maine, MAINE.
All right.
Yeah.
Terrific.
And there's lots of information about him, the teachings of Iyengar on the internet. You can just Google it.
Terrific.
Yeah.
If listeners would like to hear this show again or any of our past shows, just go to our website at nderadio.org and hit the past shows button. And for information about IANDS, go to their website at IANDS.org and be with us again next Monday, 11 a.m. Eastern for more NDE Radio. This is your host, Lee Witting, saying thanks for listening.